Eleanor. The word fell from blue lips like a prayer answered 3 years too late. Samuel Thorne's weathered hands froze above the coffee cup, steam curling between his fingers like the ghosts that haunted his Wyoming ranch. The girl couldn't be more than 16, wrapped in blankets by his fireplace, her dark hair still damp from the snowmelt. But she'd spoken his dead wife's name with the certainty of someone who'd known her personally. He'd found her 2 hours before dawn, buried beneath a drift near his eastern fence line. No horse, no wagon tracks, just a girl in a thin dress, half frozen and mumbling words he couldn't catch. The storm had been the worst in a decade, the kind that buried entire homesteads and didn't give up their secrets until spring thaw. Yet somehow she'd survived. Samuel's ranch house creaked around them, wind still howling through the gaps he'd never bothered to fix since Eleanor died. The place felt too big for one man, too quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle in the barn. He'd grown comfortable with the solitude, or at least numb to it. Then this girl appeared like something pulled from a fever dream. She stirred now, eyes fluttering open. They were the strangest shade of green he'd ever seen, like bottle glass held up to sunlight. When she looked at him, recognition flickered across her features, though he was certain they'd never met. "You saved me," she whispered, voice hoarse but steady. "Storm's past. You'll be fine once you warm up." Samuel kept his distance, coffee cup a barrier between them. "What's your name, girl?" "Sarah." She struggled to sit up, blankets pooling around her waist. Sarah Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it, like she was testing how it sounded, made his skin crawl. Outside, his horse nickered nervously in the barn. Animals knew things before people did. Always had. "Where'd you come from?" "Nearest town's 40 miles south." Sarah's eyes drifted to the window where dawn light was beginning to creep across the snow-covered landscape. "I've been walking a long time." Samuel followed her gaze. The snow stretched unbroken in every direction, pristine except for his own tracks from the rescue. No footprints, no trail, nothing to explain how she'd gotten there. When he turned back, Sarah was staring at the mantelpiece, where Eleanor's photograph sat beside a dried bouquet of wildflowers. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "She was beautiful," Sarah said softly. "You're Eleanor." Samuel's blood turned to ice water. He set the coffee cup down hard, liquid sloshing over the rim. "How do you know that name?" Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the blanket, her movements deliberate and calm. Too calm for a girl who'd nearly frozen to death. She used to pick flowers just like those. Wild lupine and Indian paintbrush. She'd say they were too pretty to leave in the fields. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Eleanor had said exactly that, dozens of times during their 7 years of marriage. But those conversations had happened in private moments, just the two of them walking the meadow behind the house, her laughing as she gathered wildflowers, while he pretended to complain about her stopping every few feet. Nobody else knew about that. Samuel's voice came out rough, dangerous. "Nobody." "She did." Sarah's green eyes held his steadily. "She told me. Eleanor's been dead 3 years." "I know." The simple admission hung between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Samuel's hand drifted instinctively toward the Colt on his hip, though what good a gun would do against whatever this was, he couldn't say. In the distance he heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching, multiple riders moving fast across the snow. Sarah heard them too. Her face went pale, and for the first time since she'd spoken Eleanor's name, fear crept into her expression. "They're coming for me," she whispered. "Who?" Before she could answer, voices carried across the wind, male voices, angry and determined. Samuel moved to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to see. 6 riders in heavy coats, their horses steaming in the cold air. The lead rider wore a sheriff's badge that caught the morning light. "Sarah Whitmore," the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow. "We know you're in there, girl. Come out peaceful, and nobody gets hurt." Samuel looked back at Sarah, who had pulled the blankets up to her chin like armor. What did you do? Nothing. Her voice was small, scared. They think I killed someone. Did you? Sarah met his eyes, and in that moment Samuel saw something that made his chest tighten. It was the same look Eleanor used to get when she was afraid, not of dying, but of being misunderstood, of being judged for something beyond her control. No, Sarah said. But they'll hang me anyway. The riders were dismounting now, boots crunching in the snow. Samuel had maybe 2 minutes before they reached his door. 2 minutes to decide whether to hand over a girl who somehow knew his dead wife's most intimate memories, or stand between her and a rope. Outside, Sheriff Morrison's voice rang out again. Samuel Thorne, send out the girl, and we'll be on our way. Samuel's weathered hands found the Winchester above the mantelpiece, muscle memory from countless nights protecting his cattle from wolves and rustlers. But this was different. This was choosing sides in a war he didn't understand, for a girl who might be touched by something beyond the natural world. Tell me the truth, he said quietly, levering around into the chamber. All of it. Sarah's eyes never left the window where shadows moved behind the curtains, men taking positions around the house like they were hunting a dangerous animal. 3 days ago, Mrs. Henderson died in her sleep. Natural causes, the doctor said. But when they found her, she was holding a letter she'd been writing. It mentioned me by name, said I'd been visiting her. So, I've never met Mrs. Henderson in my life. Sarah's voice dropped to barely a whisper, but the letter, it described conversations we'd had. Things I'd told her about people in town, about their secrets, private things only someone close to them would know. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind crawled up Samuel's spine. What kind of things? Before Sarah could answer, Sheriff Morrison's boots stomped up the porch steps. 3 heavy knocks rattled the door. Thorne, open up. Samuel's finger found the Winchester's trigger. Through the window he could see the other riders spreading out, rifles ready. They weren't here to talk. They were here to collect a prize, dead or alive. She's been to other houses, Sarah continued urgently, talking to people about their dead loved ones, telling them things only the deceased would know. The whole town thinks I'm some kind of witch. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Samuel had heard stories, whispered tales of people who could speak with spirits, who carried messages between worlds. Most folks dismissed such talk as superstition. But the way Sarah had known about Eleanor's wildflowers, the certainty in her voice when she'd spoken his wife's name. Another round of pounding shook the door. We know she's in there, Samuel. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Samuel moved to the window and called out, She's done nothing wrong, Morrison. Tell that to the families she's been tormenting. The sheriff's voice carried a hard edge. Strange girl shows up, starts spouting off about dead people's private business. Got folks scared to sleep in their own beds. Since when is talking to people a hanging offense? Since those people have been dead for years. The words hit Samuel like a slap. He turned to look at Sarah, who had gone deathly pale. Outside he could hear the distinct sound of rifles being cocked, steel sliding against steel in the cold morning air. There's something else, Sarah whispered. The reason they're really here. What? Yesterday I went to see Mayor Crawford's wife. Told her things her husband had confessed to Eleanor before he died, about the money he'd been stealing from the town fund, about the men he'd cheated out of their land. Sarah's green eyes filled with tears. She didn't want to hear it, but she couldn't unhear it either. Samuel understood now. This wasn't about witchcraft or speaking with the dead. This was about secrets, about powerful men whose buried sins were being dragged into the light by a girl who somehow carried the voices of their victims. Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the tension. You've got 30 seconds, Thorne. Then we're coming in. Samuel's hands tightened on the Winchester, but his eyes stayed on Sarah. In the firelight she looked impossibly young and fragile, like Eleanor had during their first winter together, when pneumonia had nearly taken her. He remembered sitting by their bed for 3 days, watching his wife's face grow pale as snow, whispering promises to God if he'd just let her stay. Eleanor had recovered. but she'd never forgotten those dark hours when death had felt close enough to touch. "Show me," Samuel said quietly. Sarah looked up, confused. "What? If you can really speak to them, show me. Let me hear Eleanor's voice." Sarah's eyes filled with something that might have been relief or terror. She closed them, her breathing growing shallow and measured. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside Samuel could hear Morrison's men shuffling impatiently in the snow. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had changed. It was still her voice, but underneath it, woven through it like thread through fabric, Samuel heard something else, something achingly familiar. "Samuel." The name came out like a sigh, and his knees nearly buckled. "You never fixed the loose board on the porch, the third one from the door. I used to tell you it would catch someone's boot someday." Samuel's throat went dry. Eleanor had mentioned that board 100 times, and he'd promised to fix it just as often. After she died, he'd walked around it out of habit, then out of stubbornness, then finally out of grief. Nobody else had ever noticed it. "She wants you to know," Sarah continued in that impossible voice, "that she never blamed you for what happened. The fever wasn't your fault, no matter what you tell yourself in the dark hours." Tears burned Samuel's eyes. He'd spent 3 years carrying the weight of Eleanor's death, believing he should have gotten the doctor sooner, should have seen the signs earlier, should have done something, anything different. "And she says," Sarah's voice broke slightly, "she says the reason she can speak through me is because you're not the only one who's been alone. The dead get lonely too." 20 seconds, maybe less. Samuel could hear Morrison counting down outside, could see rifle barrels glinting through the windows. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was pure Eleanor, loving, understanding, and utterly unafraid. "They'll kill you too if you protect me," she whispered, back in her own voice. Samuel thought of the empty years stretching behind him, of conversations with cattle and meals eaten in silence. He thought of Eleanor's laugh echoing through rooms that hadn't heard joy in 3 winters. Then he thought of Sarah's gift, terrible and wonderful and more real than anything he'd experienced since his wife's funeral. Some things were worth dying for, some people were worth saving. "Time's up, Thorne." Samuel moved away from the window and positioned himself between Sarah and the door. The Winchester felt steady in his hands, like an extension of his will. "Then you'd better come ready for a fight, Morrison," he called out, "because she's under my protection now." The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. Samuel heard Morrison curse under his breath, heard whispered conversations between the men outside. These weren't killers. They were frightened townspeople who'd convinced themselves they were doing God's work. But fear could make good men do terrible things. "Sarah," Samuel said without taking his eyes off the door, "is there anything Eleanor wants me to do? Any message she needs delivered?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried that strange double quality again, her words but Eleanor's warmth beneath them. "She wants you to live, Samuel. Really live, not just survive. And she wants you to help others find their peace, the way you've helped me." Before Samuel could ask what that meant, Morrison's voice rang out one final time, but the tone had changed. Instead of anger, Samuel heard uncertainty. "Thorne, we're pulling back, but that girl steps foot in town again, and we'll finish this." The sound of boots retreating, of horses being mounted, of riders moving away into the distance. Samuel stayed by the window until the last hoofbeat faded, then finally lowered the Winchester. "Why did they leave?" Sarah asked. Samuel turned to find her standing by the mantelpiece, her fingers tracing Eleanor's photograph. In the morning light streaming through the windows, she looked different somehow, older, more solid, as if defending her had somehow anchored her more firmly to the world. "Because Morrison's not stupid," Samuel said. "He knows this ranch, knows the sight lines, the cover, the fact that I've got enough ammunition to hold off an army. He also knows I'm not a man who bluffs." Over the following weeks, word spread throughout the territory about the rancher who'd sheltered the strange girl, but instead of bringing trouble, it brought visitors, people who'd lost loved ones, and heard whispers about someone who could carry messages between worlds. They came quietly at first, widows and widowers, parents who'd buried children, siblings separated by death's cruel arithmetic. Sarah would sit with them by Samuel's fireplace, her voice becoming a bridge between the living and the dead. Not all the messages were comforting, but they were all true, and truth had its own kind of healing power. Samuel found himself cooking for crowds, hosting grief and redemption in equal measure. The empty rooms of his house filled with voices again, sometimes laughter, sometimes tears, but always the sound of human connection. Eleanor's wildflowers bloomed on every window sill, tended by Sarah's careful hands. Morrison never returned, but Samuel heard through travelers that the sheriff had resigned his position after his own dead father visited him through Sarah's gift, revealing truths about Morrison's own buried shames. Some secrets, once exposed to light, lost their power to destroy. Years later, when Samuel's own hair had gone white and his hands had grown too stiff for heavy ranch work, he would sit on the porch he'd finally repaired and watch Sarah tend Eleanor's garden. She'd grown into a woman of remarkable grace, her strange gift softened by time and acceptance into something resembling peace. He never learned exactly what she was or where she'd come from that snowy night, but he'd learned that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be sheltered, nurtured and allowed to work their quiet magic on a world that had forgotten how to believe in anything beyond what it could see and touch. On quiet evenings, when the wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the meadow, Samuel could swear he heard Eleanor's laugh mixing with Sarah's voice, two souls who'd found their way home through the simple act of one man choosing love over fear.
Oh.
The third board from the door never squeaked again.